Hey, welcome to another Current Events Simplified. I am Al McCarn with Founded in Truth. I want to finish up my World in Transition series with this episode. So let's get straight to it. This is part 5, which question is it the collapse of America? You know, I'm looking at the great power rivalry among the United States, Russia, and China. And what's happened in the last week or so in the United States has given rise to this headline from the Jerusalem Post, where they're reporting that Iran, Russia, China, and Turkey are celebrating the collapse of America. Is it so? Okay, step back and do a little bit of filtering of the reporting. These 4 countries are adversaries of the United States. Each one of them would like to see the U.S. taken off the world stage because each has an agenda of its own. All of them are rivals, even though Turkey's a NATO ally. That's something I'll cover in a video at another point. But Iran is a definite adversary. Russia and China are our great power rivals. Now, why would they say this? Well, it's in their best interest to do so, even though, okay, it's not true, but their internal, it's for internal consumption. Each of these controls the press and all the information means within their borders. So that's what the Iranian, Russian, Chinese, and Turkish people are being fed by the internal propaganda systems. And they do this so as to bolster their own prestige in the sight of their own people. Because, you know, at least 2 of these regimes are on shaky ground right now. And anything they can do to show that the United States is in danger of collapse is good for them in maintaining control of their own people. But is it true? Is it true? Honestly, I don't think so, but let's go through this and see. Now, a reminder of where things are on the map. You'll see the Russia, the largest country in the world via land mass, but only 145 million Russians live there. China, 1.5 billion people, largest population on Earth, but their land mass is less than that of the United States. And the U.S. has, you know, almost 350 million people with a global reach. You can see the countries in light blue there are allies of the United States. NATO countries, long-standing allies, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines. And then in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, the Gulf states, all of them have ties with the United States for, you know, militarily, economically, culturally, politically. So truly a global reach. Russia has ties with the republics of the former Soviet Union in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. China has only 2 friends, Iran and North Korea, but they have a lot of clout. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The nations in purple, well, they're kind of in play. 4 of them are war zones: Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. And they are caught between the superpowers. So which way they will turn out or which side they'll fall out on, not sure. It depends. Then there's this little green dot on the South China Sea, and that is Hong Kong. I will talk about Hong Kong as we move along. Okay, how does the great power rivalry shape up? Well, 2 forms of power, remember. The soft power, which is the culture, the ideology, the institutions, whatever you can to put forth a positive image and influence people around the world to like you. And the Chinese are very good at this. Actually, the Russians and the Americans are very good at this as well. But if you do not have hard power, namely strong military, strong economy, if you don't have that to back up your soft power, then you don't have lasting influence. Okay, how does the hard power stack up? Well, it's actually fairly even. The United States is a global presence, as I said, and the USS Eisenhower and USS Truman are 2 of our 11 aircraft carriers, which are symbols of American global power. The Air Force, the Navy can project American power anywhere in the world in a very short amount of time. The Russians and the Chinese do not have that capability, even though the Chinese have the largest land army in the world, and the Russians have a very large, very capable land army, as well as strategic rocket forces. And oh, by the way, these two pictures you see are from Vostok 2018, where the Russians and the Chinese had a training exercise together, and it provided for some very good photo ops. Now, the Russians and the Americans are not interested in a land war in Asia going against China because China is too big. They have too large of an army. Just don't want to go there. Doesn't look like prospects are favorable for winning. Likewise, U.S. and China are not interested in invading Russia because it is too big. And other invaders have failed over the last 2.5 centuries. And can the Russians and the Chinese reach the United States and invade? Nope, not a chance. But maybe they can fight with their nuclear weapons. Would that work? Well, no, the nuclear weapons are a deterrent. U.S. and Russia have the largest nuclear arsenals by far in the whole world, over 6,000 warheads each. China has about 300 warheads, comes in fourth after France. And it's strictly a defensive deterrent. But no one wants to go nuclear because it means destruction for the whole world if that happens. So how do we fight? Well, we use other means to fight. One is in diplomatic circles, such as you see here with the Russian ambassador to the United Nations vetoing a resolution in the Security Council. Russia, US, China, Britain, and France are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. The other 10 seats on the council rotate every year with different countries. If any of those 5 permanent members disagrees with an action, they can veto it and the action fails. The US and Russia, and before them the Soviet Union, have used that veto power frequently. And that's just one means at their disposal in the diplomatic realm. War, by the way, is just the other side of the coin of diplomacy. And each of these nations are adept at diplomacy. They have a robust foreign policy system and diplomatic corps. The Russians are at times, I would say, probably better at it than the other two. But again, they're all very powerful diplomatically. What's another way to fight a war? Well, throw money at a problem. And that's what the Chinese have done with their Belt and Road Initiative announced in 2013, a series of investments in the development infrastructure of countries along the old Silk Road from East Asia to Europe. And that's what the Chinese want to do, is create air or land and sea routes and develop these in Central Asia in particular and tie them to China. And that gives China a way to expand its influence, buying influence for one thing by building infrastructure, but then being able to project and export its goods and such to Europe, to South Asia, to Africa very easily. So what's another way? Well, straight up trade war. You know, the United States and the other great powers have been very good at economic warfare for a long time. That's why the US and China have been involved in a trade war for the last couple of years. Having a president in Donald Trump who understands international finance and business, he is adept at this, and he's also quite the negotiator, being able to understand his strengths and weaknesses and those of his opponents. So that's why the US has come off on the upper hand in the recent trade war with China. But there is another means of warfare that is now coming into its own, and that is cyber warfare. You know, taking down the other guy's computer systems, hacking into it, taking down infrastructure by remote means. Now, this has got an offensive and a defensive component because cybersecurity is a big deal as well. And you know what? Each of these three powers are very, very good at cyber operations. The US, particularly on the defensive side, the Chinese and the Russians on the offensive side. Now, who else is good? Well, you know, the Israelis, the Iranians, the North Koreans. A lot of countries are good at this, but the three superpowers, while not you know, they're top tier. And yes, do engage in operations against each other. So where will this go? Well, it's just part of the sphere of conflict now. So let's see if we can look at this in scale and try to understand who's got the greatest advantage. Let's compare the US and Russia. Oh, wait, no, we're comparing Texas and Russia. These are 2018 numbers. Russia is a G20 country. It's one of the strongest economies in the whole world. And their economy is smaller than that of Texas. Can you believe that? 30 million Texans outproducing 144 million Russians. And look at the GDP per capita. A family in Texas earning $50,000 more a year than a family in Russia. That says a lot. And this is the second strongest military in the world. It's the largest country in the world. And the Russians project their power rather well. But they're doing it with an economy that's smaller than the economy of Texas. How do they do that? That's a good question. But it is a matter of scale. Let's look at another economic comparison. These numbers are from 2017. I got them from the CIA World Fact Book, which is a good one-stop shop for reasonably accurate data. And this tells you that the largest economy in 2017 was China's, with a GDP of $23.2 trillion, followed by the United States with a GDP of $19.5 trillion. Now, there are other economic ways of measuring, but this gives you an idea. Still, the US has the much larger GDP per capita than Russia or China. But here's the Achilles heel, and it's the debt. Look at this, almost $18 trillion of external debt that's owned by somebody else. Oh, and the somebody else is largely Chinese. They've been buying up American debt. In fact, a lot of countries have been buying up American debt. Why are they willing to buy up American debt? Oh, that's because the dollar is a stable currency, and it is used as the world's reserve currency. So you want to trade oil and other commodities, you do it in dollars. The ruble and the yuan do not have that strength nor that stability. The dollar is so strong because the US government and economy is so strong and resilient. So as long as that is true, then the United States can continue exporting its debt. Still, it's the Achilles heel of the US, period. It would be really nice if we could transition from being a consumer society to a producer and saver society. That would be really good. But until then, here's the question. What happens if the Chinese and the other foreign lenders call in their debts? What then? Do we just declare bankruptcy and roll over and let them have their way? No. We could do a lot of things, like even repudiate the debt and say, we ain't paying, come get it. And what would they do? Try to come get it? With what army? Well, their army, yes, but it would be very difficult for Chinese and Russian Marines to come land on American soil and extort money from us, which is kind of ironic because that's what the great powers did all throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Here's a political cartoon from 1904. That's President Theodore Roosevelt, whose motto was walk softly and carry a big stick. And he's towing the US Navy, which is his debt collection instrument. This is reference to how we got the Panama Canal. The United States wanted to build that canal through Panama, but at the time, Colombia controlled Panama. And they didn't want the US to build a canal through Panama. So what happens is the US capitalized on Panamanian discontent. And when the Panamanians rose up and demanded their independence, the US Navy intervened and the Colombians couldn't prevent it. So Panama became an independent country. The United States concluded a deal with them and built the canal. That's how the great powers operated. You know, it's how Britain got an upper hand in China in the 1840s with the Opium Wars. It's how France got control of Mexico in the 1860s, going to collect on the Mexicans' debt. It's how France controlled Morocco in 1908, collecting on the Moroccans' debt. It's how everybody kept the Ottoman Empire at bay throughout the 19th century, lending them money, and then when they couldn't pay, well, coming in and taking concessions. So would the Chinese or the other debt holders do this for the United States? They'll try. But if they do, it means the whole global economy is reset and everybody is hurt. So it's a standoff. So how's the standoff resolved? Well, how were these things resolved historically? In 1989, the standoff in the Cold War was resolved when millions of Eastern Europeans voted with their feet, when they saw the bankruptcy in the Soviet system and realized that after 70 years of atheistic, communist, totalitarian government in the Soviet Union and its client states, that there was really nothing better that they could hope for. All that the communist governments could promise was material goods and a better materialistic life. Because if you're not believing in God or any purpose for human existence, then what good is there? What hope is there? What is the foundation for right and wrong? It's a bankrupt system that exists only to keep itself in power. And Czechs and Hungarians and Poles and Romanians and Germans and Russians, they recognize this. And that's why the Soviet Empire came down virtually overnight like a house of cards. Is that happening today? Quite possibly. We see it in Hong Kong, a city that has been in protest for a year now. 7.2 million people, half of them have been in the streets protesting. Why? Well, see, Hong Kong is an autonomous zone within the People's Republic of China. It was part of the British Empire until 1997, and when it reverted to Chinese control, it was under a treaty that said China would allow Hong Kong to retain its democratic institutions, its capitalist economy, and its own government and security systems as an autonomous city, but it would still be within the sphere of the People's Republic of China. One country, two systems. Well, China was supposed to maintain that at least until 2047, and they've been steadily encroaching on Hong Kong. And lately, in the last 3 weeks, have floated a law in Beijing that would take away Hong Kong's basic laws and replace them with Beijing's laws for the rest of the country. So Hong Kong would lose its special status, its privileged position, its culture, everything that defines Hong Kong. That's why the people of Hong Kong are protesting, even though they are being brutally repressed. Is this happening in the rest of China? Well, yeah, not to this scale yet. But Chinese people, after 70 years of communist dictatorship, are seeing the same thing that Eastern Europeans were seeing in 1989. There's a corrupt regime. The foundations have been cut away. There's no longer a purpose for living except maybe have a better materialistic life. And even then, it's slow in coming and it doesn't measure up to the West. So how will this translate to regime stability? We shall see. We shall see. But is the same thing happening here? Maybe. A black man was killed by a police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He didn't deserve to die. He was brutally killed, and millions of Americans have reacted. Sadly, that means there have been riots on top of protests, peaceful protests. So does that mean America is coming unhinged and collapsing? Let's look at it historically. I grew up in the civil rights era in Birmingham, Alabama. My city was a zone of conflict at that time when a segment of the population was rising up and saying, we are human beings and we have an oppressive system here that is denying us our basic humanity. That was the civil rights movement. But as you can see, in 1963, police officers put dogs on peaceful protesters. In 1965, with the great Selma to Montgomery March, Martin Luther King was in danger of assassination there, even though police watched the march carefully. And you can see most of those faces in that picture are black. There are a few white faces, but they're not from Alabama. They are from outside, from the north. They have come in to help and show solidarity. But this is an internal movement, a black movement struggling for freedom and recognition against an oppressive white majority system. when Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, riots sprung up all across the United States, and they were put down. They had to be, just to protect the infrastructure and property and people's lives. And you see the aftermath in Washington, D.C. So is that what's happening today in 2020 in the United States? No, no, it is not. Yes, there are riots, but it is a vocal, violent minority. And what do they want? Well, they want anything but the system that exists now. I'm not going to pretend to say I know, but what I can tell you is what has happened in Minneapolis, in Houston, in Georgia, Florida, New Jersey, all across the country. We have Americans cutting across racial lines, across sectarian lines, across economic lines, across generational lines, all who have said something is seriously wrong. It's not necessarily the system, it's us, it's our hearts. We are the ones who have cut away the foundation. We are the ones who still harbor division and resentment and prejudice. Maybe we should look internally and fix that. And that's why you see 60,000 peaceful protesters led by the George Floyd family in Houston and the city of Houston's leadership. And they began with prayer. That's why you see white police officers in solidarity with protesters. A black pastor in Los Angeles hugging a white police officer. See, this is an American thing. It's not rising up against an oppressive system. It's rising up against what we ourselves are. And we want to try to move forward now with the next step in fixing this problem. The foundation has been shaken, but not cut away. Why? Because America is still a Christian country, and the Judeo-Christian values on which it was built are still there. Unlike the Communist Soviet Union and the Communist People's Republic of China and Russia today, which is still trying to recover its foundation. So I don't think this is the collapse of America. I think it is the dawn of a new day in America. And the great power rivalry will continue. But perhaps we shall see a better world because of what we have gone through even now. So in closing, what did David say in Psalm 11? If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Well, the answer is maintain your righteousness, that which God has taught us through his word and through his Holy Spirit, because God tests the righteous and he upholds the upright, regardless of your circumstances. Keep your eye on him. That is all I have to share at this point. So thank you very much for listening. For Founded in Truth, this is Al McCarn.